Hello everybody and welcome to Farmhouse Lilies. I am so excited to have you here with me on one of my very first videos. I am so excited. Let's get started. Today we are working on a 100% freshly ground whole wheat biscuit recipe. And I have a couple of tips and tricks to help you keep your biscuits as light and fluffy as ever. So in order to start this mixture, we are going to mix our dry ingredients together. So I have some freshly ground whole wheat that I just ground about half an hour ago. I let it sit for just a little bit and I measured it using grams because freshly milled flour is lighter and fluffier, not lighter, but fluffier than your traditional stored flour because your stored flour has had time to settle. So as a result, we are using gram measurements to accommodate for that fluffy difference. So we are going to add salt and baking powder and cream of tartar. And this recipe calls for egg. I am using freeze-dried egg, one freeze-dried egg. You could use the equivalent of one powdered egg, or even you could use a hard-boiled egg yolk and powder it just with your hands and sprinkle it in your flour mixture. This just helps coat your flour in fat, which helps prevent gluten formation, which is what makes, excess gluten formation is what makes your biscuits not light and fluffy. So we want a light and fluffy mixture. Now that that's all mixed up, I'm gonna take out my butter from the fridge and we're gonna grate it. This is gonna help us get awesome, perfectly sized butter shreds that will be perfect to make flaky layers in our biscuits. We're also going to shred some on the side to sprinkle on top of our layers so that we can really make sure to get defined layers with this. Now I have my nice cold butter from the fridge. I am going to shred my half cup for my butter mixture, and then we will start forming our dough and then work on doing our other shreds. Now that we have our butter shreds, we are going to cut our butter into our flour just by mixing it up a little bit. We're not actually cutting in the butter to the flour because we already did the smallingization of the butter. So now we're just gonna put it in the flour and get it all nice and coated. And we just wanna use nice and gentle hands and separate all these butter clumps. And you'll notice that some of these shreds kind of stick together, and just smush those with your thumb to make a nice flake. That will actually be really beneficial in our biscuits. All right, now that everything is all mixed, we are going to go ahead and mix together our wet ingredients. We have a cup of buttermilk, and then our sweetener for this is 2 tablespoons of maple syrup. And I'm just using a dough whisk to mix this in all together. Now we are just going to be super light in mixing this all together. And we're just gonna stir until just barely combined, and then we're gonna dump it out onto the counter. All right, everything is just barely combined here. We're gonna dump it onto the counter. And now we're just gonna kind of smush it all together here. Whew. There are gonna be some sticky parts because not everything is equally hydrated. And I like to use a bench scraper to cut out my dough. But before we do that, we are just gonna take our grater and we're gonna grate some more butter on top. And this is kind of what's gonna help us get some flaky layers in here. That was maybe about a tablespoon. Now we're going to cut and kind of, it's gonna be hard because it's gonna be kind of crumbly. Layer our dough on top of the other half. And just kind of gather up our extra non-hydrated flour here, because we're really trying to prevent this gluten from forming. It's very similar to a pie crust. this recipe is. Shape it into a rectangle, cut it in half, and we're just creating layers here. Even them out on my dough. Woo. Cut in half again. And now we're just going to place it on top. Okay, because I still have this layer of butter, I am going to go ahead and cut it again and fold it over itself. And you can already see a lot of these layers coming into play. Now we're just going to squish it down into the size that we want to cut our biscuits into. And you can tell, like, I'm not really handling this dough with my hands. And you can't really mess this up, because if they don't turn out super flaky, you can still eat them. I mean, I made some yesterday and totally failed as I was accidentally using the wrong flour. I used a croissant flour instead of a whole wheat flour, so I ground some croissant instead of my hard white wheat berries, and that was an interesting thing. It tasted really good, but it did not turn out the same. Okay, so now that we have our square, we're just gonna score where we want our biscuits to be. I like to divide it into thirds and get about 9 biscuits. Good enough for me. Perfect. Okay, I am just going to use a little bit of this butter to butter my cast iron. I'm not super worried about it sticking because it is a pretty decent cast iron. Not as thick of a coating as I was like yet, but now I have a great butter on my bottom of my cast iron, and I'm just going to place these around and rearrange them until they all fit. And be gentle with them because these layers will pull apart, which is what we want. And they don't mind being close to each other. You just don't want them to squish each other. Right, now we're just going to put them in our oven at 425 until they're nice and golden brown on the top. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes for me in my oven, which is not a convection oven, so it takes quite a bit longer for my oven.